Paris, October 12th, 1307. Night settles over the city with deceptive calm, the kind that arrives just before something irreversible breaks the surface of history. Narrow streets glisten with damp stone, and within the fortified temple complex, the Knights Templar move through routines practiced for generations. Prayers are whispered, ledgers are closed, candles burn low. To an outside observer, nothing seems unusual. Yet beneath the stillness, the air feels charged, as if the city is holding its breath. What no one beyond the inner circle realizes is that this night is already too late. Orders have been sent. Messages have traveled faster than armies. Somewhere far from Paris, sails catch wind, ropes are cut, and hulls turn toward open water. The most powerful military financial order in Europe is not scrambling in panic. It is executing a plan. King Philip's warrant, sealed in secret, is meant to strike at dawn, catching the Templars unaware. That is the official story historians repeat. Yet inside the temple, signs of preparation defy coincidence. Certain vaults stand empty. Certain documents are gone. Certain brothers are absent, assigned to duties no one later admits existed. The city sleeps, unaware that by morning the order will be shattered in chains and accusations. Yet the true loss will not be measured in arrests or confessions. It will be measured in what is no longer there. As Paris drifts toward dawn, the knock approaches, but the Templar story is slipping beyond reach quietly. When royal officials finally turned their attention to La Rochelle, they expected noise, confusion, resistance. Instead, they found emptiness. The harbor, one of the most important ports in medieval France, lay strangely quiet. This was not a minor outpost. La Rochelle was the maritime heart of the Knights Templar, the place where their ships gathered, resupplied, and vanished toward distant horizons. According to every rule of medieval logistics, dozens of vessels should have been anchored there, but they were gone. No wreckage floated offshore. No half-loaded cargo sat abandoned on the docks. Warehouses stood locked, orderly, as if departure had followed a schedule. Chroniclers would later admit their confusion, struggling to explain how an entire fleet could disappear without witnesses, records, or pursuit. In an age where even small ships drew attention, silence on this scale feels impossible. The disappearance becomes even stranger when timelines are examined. The king's orders moved quickly, carried by trusted messengers under threat of death. Yet somehow the ships were already at sea before the arrests began. That suggests foreknowledge, coordination, and a chain of command operating beyond the reach of the crown. Historians argue over explanations, exaggeration, poor records, coincidence. None fully satisfy. Fleets do not evaporate. Ports do not forget. And kingdoms do not lose sight of naval power without consequence. Whatever left, La Rochelle did so deliberately, efficiently, and without leaving behind a single answer. History waits, watching the water, still refusing to give them. At dawn, the king's men arrive with authority and expectation. They come armed with seals, writs, and certainty, believing they are about to seize the wealth of the most powerful order in Christendom. La Rochelle should have delivered proof of victory: ships, cargo, gold, and terrified brothers caught mid-flight. Instead, the docks greet them with silence. Warehouses stand unlocked but hollow. Crates, once marked with the Red Cross, are gone. Ropes hang loose, not cut in haste, but untied with care. Even the harbor water seems undisturbed, as if no fleet had rested there days before. Officials search for evidence of panic, yet find only order. Whatever happened here was planned, not improvised. The absence is more than logistical, it is psychological. The king's strategy depended on surprise, on striking before the Templars could react. But La Rochelle tells a different story, one where reaction came first. Someone warned them, someone trusted, understood the threat early enough to act. This realization unsettles the royal officers. If the order had time to clear its ports, how far back does the preparation go? Weeks, months, years? The idea is dangerous because it suggests that the arrests were never the opening move, but the final act of a game already lost. By the time reports reach Paris, confusion replaces triumph. Assets meant to fund the crown have vanished. Ships that could be hunted are already beyond reach. The docks remain empty, offering no resistance, only a question. The silence at La Rochelle does not close the story, it opens it. Fleets do not simply disappear, especially fleets belonging to an order built on discipline, foresight, and control. Every missing ship points outward toward a destination deliberately chosen. Somewhere beyond the horizon, sails carried more than wood and canvas. They carried choices that history was never meant to see. This is where certainty collapses into speculation. If the Templars escaped with their fleet, then the fall of the order was incomplete. Power was not destroyed, only displaced. A mobile force, loyal, wealthy, and unseen, becomes something far more dangerous than an imprisoned brotherhood. It becomes a ghost. Historians prefer endings that feel final, arrests, trials, executions. But the empty docks refuse that comfort. They suggest continuity rather than collapse, planning rather than chaos. Whoever commanded those ships understood that survival did not mean fighting, it meant vanishing. And so the question lingers centuries later, unanswered and unsettling. Where did the fleet go, and why has no authority ever traced its path? The absence echoes through later centuries, surfacing in rumors, symbols, and sudden appearances of unexplained wealth and influence. Perhaps the greatest achievement of the Knights Templar was not their rise, but their disappearance. If the fleet survived, then history did not unfold by accident alone. It was guided, redirected quietly by men who learned that the safest place to hold power is beyond the reach of memory itself, forever and unseen. The Knights Templar are often imagined as armored monks bound to a single battlefield, yet that image hides their true power. From the 12th century onward, the order operated across Europe, the Levant, and the Mediterranean as a coordinated system, not a loose brotherhood. Commands issued in Jerusalem could be executed in Paris, London, or Acre with remarkable speed for a medieval world. Their strength lay in structure. Each commandery functioned like a node in a network, sharing information, resources, and personnel. Couriers moved constantly along safe routes, carrying coded instructions and financial data. Brothers transferred between regions without explanation, protected by papal authority that placed them above local law. Kings ruled land. The Templars moved through it freely. This created something unprecedented, an organization that thought globally while others thought locally. They tracked political shifts, trade routes, and military threats with the awareness of a modern intelligence service. When danger approached, signals did not need to be shouted. They were already understood. Seen this way, the disappearance of the fleet feels less miraculous. It feels procedural. Orders could be issued quietly, trusted men assigned, and movements synchronized across borders. No single port needed to know the whole plan. Each only knew its part. The Templars were not surprised in 1307. They were prepared by decades of operating like a state without borders, a power trained to move silently when survival demanded it. That readiness would soon determine what the world never saw again: Behind the swords and vows existed another engine of Templar power, one far less visible and far more unsettling. The Order had become the financial backbone of medieval Europe, managing wealth on a scale few kingdoms could rival. Kings deposited fortunes with them, nobles entrusted estates. Pilgrims carried letters of credit that functioned like early banknotes. Gold moved without ever being seen. The system depended on trust, secrecy, and precise record keeping. Templar houses could accept funds in one city and release them in another, bypassing bandits, borders, and even royal taxation. In effect, they controlled a shadow economy that spanned continents. Money flowed through coded ledgers and secure vaults, accessible only to initiated brothers. When the arrests came, officials expected to seize this wealth. Instead, they found gaps where certainty should have been. Treasuries were lighter than expected. Records were incomplete. The sums did not add up. Chroniclers noted the discrepancy, then quietly moved on, unwilling to speculate too far. This raises an uncomfortable possibility. If the fleet vanished, it may not have carried soldiers alone. It may have carried the liquid wealth of an empire without a crown. Gold, silver, contracts, and obligations capable of buying protection anywhere. Such wealth would not need conquest to survive. It would need only discretion. And once at sea, beyond confiscation, it could finance futures historians never thought to trace. Castles project power, but ships preserve it. The Templars understood this distinction better than most medieval rulers. Stone walls tie you to land. Fleets give you options. They allow retreat without surrender and movement without permission. For an order operating across borders, naval power was not a luxury. It was insurance. Ships enabled secrecy. Cargo could be divided, rerouted, or lost deliberately. Men could vanish into new identities, far from inquisitors and kings. Messages could move faster by sea than by any road. When survival depended on timing, water offered silence. This is why the absence of the fleet matters more than the fall of any fortress. Fleets do not disappear by accident. They require planning, crews, provisions, and destinations. They require intent. The Templars had invested in ships not for glory, but for flexibility. When pressure mounted, castles became liabilities. Ports became exits. A fleet could dissolve into smaller groups, heading toward multiple horizons. Pursuit would require coordination no medieval crown possessed. Seen through this lens, La Rochelle was not abandoned. It was completed, its purpose fulfilled. The fleet's disappearance was not a loss. It was the execution of a design built precisely for moments when visibility became fatal. To the outside world, the fall of the Templars looked sudden and absolute. Trials followed arrests. Confessions followed torture. The narrative closed neatly, but that version relies on what was visible, not on what was controlled. Inside the order, hierarchy, limited knowledge, carefully, few brothers ever understood the full picture. This makes it possible that the fleet belonged to a contingency plan known only to the highest ranks, a final protocol activated when political protection failed. Such planning would explain the precision, the silence, and the lack of panic. The order did not improvise under threat. It transitioned. Historians struggle here because evidence thins by design. Plans meant to survive collapse are not written openly. They live in oaths, symbols, and trusted chains of command. When those men vanished, so did their instructions. What remains are fragments, missing ships, unexplained wealth, and later institutions that seem strangely familiar. Patterns without documentation, effects without causes. The public never saw the full architecture of the Templars, because it was never meant to be seen. If the fleet was part of that hidden design, then its disappearance marks not an ending, but the moment the story passed beyond record and into shadow. La Rochelle was not just another medieval port. It was a place where geography, politics, and quiet defiance intersected in ways that made kings uneasy. Sitting on France's Atlantic coast, it opened directly to the open ocean, bypassing narrow straits and hostile checkpoints. From here, ships could vanish westward or southward without passing under the watchful eyes of rival powers. For anyone planning a discreet departure, there was no better starting point. What made La Rochelle truly unique, however, was its autonomy. The city had long resisted royal control, negotiating privileges that allowed it to govern itself with unusual independence. Its loyalties were commercial and practical, not ideological. Merchants, sailors, and guilds held more influence than distant monarchs. This environment aligned perfectly with the Templars, who thrived in spaces where authority was diffuse and negotiable. The order had invested heavily in the port. They owned warehouses, docks, and safe houses woven into the fabric of the city. Their ships were familiar sights, their banners unremarkable to locals accustomed to constant maritime traffic. This normalcy was their camouflage. In moments of crisis, escape requires more than speed. It requires cooperation, silence, and infrastructure already in place. La Rochelle offered all three. It was loyal, not out of devotion, but because the Templars had become part of its economy. When the time came to leave, the harbor did not resist. It simply opened, and history slipped quietly through. Medieval Europe was obsessed with documentation. Ships were taxed, inspected, and recorded. Cargoes were listed, crews were counted. Ports lived on paperwork as much as trade. That is why the disappearance of the Templar fleet from La Rochelle feels so unnatural. According to surviving records, nothing happened. And that is precisely the problem. There are no departure manifests, no customs fees collected, no scribes noting unusual traffic, even hostile. Chroniclers, eager to catalog Templar crimes, fall silent when it comes to the ships. The absence is total, as if the fleet never existed at all. For historians, this creates a void that cannot be explained by loss alone. One possibility is deliberate erasure. Documents can be destroyed, altered, or never written. In a city accustomed to negotiating its own rules, procedures could be bypassed with quiet agreement. Another possibility is fragmentation. Ships may have departed in small groups at odd hours, blending into normal traffic until the pattern vanished. Yet even this explanation strains belief. An entire naval force requires coordination. Someone should have noticed. Someone should have spoken. Instead, the records offer nothing but silence, forcing scholars into uncomfortable territory where absence becomes evidence. The ships did not leave chaos behind. They left nothing at all. And in historical investigation, nothing is often the loudest clue. When later investigators turned to the people of La Rochelle, they expected stories. Ports are places of gossip, observation, and rumor. Sailors talk, dock workers remember. Yet again and again, accounts returned the same unsettling phrase: "We saw nothing." Not denial, not confusion, nothing. This uniformity is suspicious. Memory fades unevenly, not collectively. For an entire population to recall nothing suggests either extraordinary coincidence or quiet consensus. Some historians argue fear erased testimony. Others suggest loyalty, whether bought through economics or forged through long association with the Templars. There is also the possibility of normalization. If departures occurred gradually, nothing would have seemed unusual. Ships came and went constantly. Familiar crews loading familiar cargo would not draw attention, even if collectively they represented something unprecedented. But the phrasing matters. We saw nothing is not the same as nothing happened. It implies awareness of expectation, a response to questioning rather than a spontaneous memory. It feels guarded, as if the safest answer was emptiness. Centuries later, that silence still echoes. It forms a human wall around the event, as impenetrable as missing documents. Whether out of fear, loyalty, or instruction, the people of La Rochelle carried the secret forward by refusing to give it shape. If an entire fleet belonging to one of Europe's most powerful institutions vanished, history should have recorded shock waves. Naval balances should have shifted. Markets should have trembled. Yet no such reaction appears. The departure registers as a non-event, a historical ghost that leaves no immediate trace. This is perhaps the strangest element of all. Large movements usually create ripples, even when undocumented. Rivals notice absences. Allies ask questions. But in this case, the world continues as if nothing significant occurred. It is as though the disappearance was anticipated, absorbed, or deliberately ignored. That raises a disturbing possibility. Perhaps the fleet's departure did not disrupt existing power structures because it aligned with forces already in motion. Perhaps those ships were not leaving history, but repositioning within it. If so, their impact would be subtle, emerging later in unexpected places. Historians struggle with events that refuse to announce themselves. The absence of reaction tempts dismissal, yet the scale resists it. Something enormous happened at La Rochelle, and it passed beneath the threshold of recognition. That is why this departure remains so dangerous to ignore. It suggests a level of coordination and foresight that operates outside conventional narratives. History did not mark the moment because history, in that instant, lost sight of what mattered most. When the papal decree dissolving the Knights Templar spread across Europe, most kingdoms complied swiftly. Arrests were carried out, property seized, and the order was erased with brutal efficiency. Portugal, however, behaved differently. King Dinis did not rush to condemn the men who had defended his borders for generations. Instead, he hesitated, questioned, and quietly resisted pressure from Rome. Portugal's relationship with the Templars had always been practical rather than ideological. They were frontier warriors, instrumental in reclaiming territory during the Reconquista. Their fortresses guarded vulnerable borders. Their wealth funded expansion. To suddenly brand them heretics made little sense to a king who relied on their infrastructure. Rather than destroy them, Dinis offered protection. Trials were minimal. Confiscations were restrained. Former Templars were allowed to remain, regroup, and continue serving the crown under supervision. This alone sets Portugal apart from the rest of Europe and invites a dangerous question. Was this mercy or preparation? If ships vanished from La Rochelle, Portugal lay perfectly positioned to receive them. Its Atlantic coastline offered discreet harbors beyond French control. Papal authority weakened with distance, and royal power was centralized enough to enforce silence. The Pope protested. Portugal delayed. Negotiations stretched on, while something else quietly took shape. The survival of Templar personnel here was not accidental. It was tolerated, managed, and ultimately formalized. In a time when defying Rome invited catastrophe, Portugal chose accommodation over obedience. That choice may explain why the trail of the Templar fleet does not end at sea, but curves quietly toward Iberian shores. In the decades following 1307, Portugal experienced a sudden and puzzling surge in naval capability. Shipyards expanded. Maritime expeditions multiplied. Most strikingly, the sails of Portuguese vessels bore a familiar emblem, a red cross, unmistakably reminiscent of Templar symbolism. Official explanations dismiss this as coincidence or generic crusader imagery, yet the timing feels uncomfortably precise. These ships were not experimental coastal craft. They were ocean-capable vessels, suited for long voyages and heavy cargo. Portugal, previously limited in naval reach, began behaving like a seafaring power, preparing for something vast. Funding appeared, expertise emerged, knowledge flowed from nowhere historians can clearly identify. The cross itself matters. Symbols survive when names cannot. To those who knew how to read them, such imagery could signal continuity beneath transformation. It could also function as reassurance, a quiet message that the old network still existed, merely reconfigured. Critics argue that Portugal's maritime rise belongs to a later age, yet seeds must be planted before forests grow. The early 14th century marks an inflection point, subtle but real. Ships capable of reaching unknown waters do not materialize overnight. If former Templars arrived with ships, maps, and experience, Portugal offered the perfect laboratory. Under royal protection, knowledge could be preserved without scrutiny. The fleet that vanished may not have disappeared at all. It may have simply changed flags. In 1319, Rome approved a curious solution. The Knights Templar were officially gone, but in Portugal, a new institution emerged almost immediately, the Order of Christ. Its members included many former Templars. Its properties were largely the same. Its mission echoed familiar vows, only softened by new language. On paper, this was a compromise. In practice, it was continuity disguised as reform. The Order of Christ inherited Templar wealth, fortresses, and personnel, all under the authority of the Portuguese crown. What disappeared was not the structure, but the name. This transformation solved multiple problems at once. It appeased the Pope without dismantling Portugal's defenses. It protected experienced knights from persecution. Most importantly, it preserved institutional memory. Knowledge accumulated over centuries did not vanish into prison cells or execution pyres. If the fleet required guardianship, this new order provided legitimacy. Ships could be justified as royal assets. Voyages could be framed as exploration rather than escape. The past could be buried beneath official approval. Historians debate how intentional this continuity was. Some argue necessity forced compromise. Others see deliberate preservation. The speed of the transition suggests planning, not improvisation. If the Templars survived anywhere, they survived here, reborn through legal fiction. Their disappearance becomes semantic, not factual. The question then shifts from whether they escaped to how far their influence extended afterward. Portugal answers many questions, but it does not end them. A safe harbor explains survival, not purpose. If the fleet reached Iberian shores, why does the story not stop there? Why do symbols, rumors, and unexplained connections continue to appear far beyond Portugal's borders? One possibility is that Portugal was never meant to be the final destination. It may have served as a staging ground, a place to regroup, reorganize, and decide what came next. From here, ships could move south along Africa, west into the Atlantic, or vanish into trade routes stretching beyond Europe's imagination. Portugal's later role in global exploration fuels suspicion. The navigators of the 15th century operated with confidence that feels inherited. Routes were tested. Winds were understood. The ocean was treated not as a mystery, but as a system. Knowledge like that rarely begins from nothing. If the Templar fleet carried more than men and money, if it carried information, then Portugal was the logical place to protect it until the world was ready, or until power shifted enough to use it safely. Whether Portugal was sanctuary or stepping stone remains unresolved. What is clear is that the trail does not end in compliance or collapse. It bends outward toward horizons that history prefers to attribute to later heroes. The fleet may have paused here, but its journey feels unfinished. By 1307, Scotland occupied a strange position in Europe, isolated not just by geography but by faith and politics. King Robert the Bruce stood excommunicated, locked in conflict with both England and the authority of Rome. Papal commands carried little weight in a land already condemned. For the hunted Knights Templar, this made Scotland unusually safe. While France and England enforced arrests with zeal, Scotland lacked both the will and the incentive. Bruce needed soldiers, fortifications, and allies who understood warfare. The Templars possessed all three. Their loyalty to a king already rejected by the church posed no contradiction. In fact, it aligned perfectly. This political exile created silence. Papal agents hesitated to operate openly. Records grew thin. Movements went unreported. A small group of ships arriving on a rugged coastline would not have raised alarms, especially during years of war and instability. Scotland's ports were scattered, its shores difficult to patrol. Refugee could be found without ceremony. Survival here required blending into chaos, not announcing presence. If the Templar fleet sought a place beyond papal reach, Scotland offered something rare: indifference. Rome's laws already meant little. What mattered was loyalty and utility. That environment may explain why whispers of Templar survival cluster here, where obedience had already collapsed and secrecy came naturally. In such conditions, disappearance was not suspicious but expected, allowing old orders to fade quietly into legend while their men endured unseen beyond borders, memory, and official chronicles forever in Europe. In 1314, at Bannockburn, Scotland defied expectation and shattered English dominance. Legends claim that on this battlefield, armored figures rode in support of Robert the Bruce, turning the tide at a critical moment. Some say they bore no banners. Others whisper they fought like men with nothing left to lose. Mainstream historians dismiss these stories as romantic invention, yet the gaps are real. Contemporary accounts are incomplete, strangely silent about certain movements. Numbers do not align. Victory arrives with unsettling speed. Something happened that chroniclers either could not explain or chose not to record. Templar involvement would explain the mystery. Experienced heavy cavalry appearing unexpectedly could change everything. Men already condemned by Rome would have little reason to fear further damnation. For them, Bannockburn offered purpose, yet proof remains elusive. No documents confirm their presence. No graves bear their marks. What survives are patterns and persistence. The story refuses to disappear despite scholarly discomfort. That refusal matters. Myths endure when they resonate with buried truth. Bannockburn may not prove Templar survival, but it suggests possibility. And in historical mystery, possibility is often the first crack where certainty begins to fail. Absence of evidence becomes its own signal, forcing historians to confront why this battle attracts secrecy, speculation, and denial more than any medieval clash of comparable scale. It lingers because victory feels assisted, as if unseen hands briefly entered history, then withdrew, leaving triumph without attribution or explanation for those willing to notice carefully. South of Edinburgh stands Rochelle Chapel, a structure that unsettles historians more with questions than answers. Built decades after the Templars' fall, it displays carvings that seem anachronistic, intricate, and strangely familiar. Plants resembling New World corn appear centuries before official contact. Symbols echo Templar imagery long after its supposed extinction. Scholars propose conventional explanations, yet none fully satisfy. Why preserve outlawed symbols in sacred stone? Why embed coded geometry in mythic scenes that serve no orthodox purpose? The chapel feels less like devotion and more like memory. Beyond Roslin, similar motifs surface across Scotland: crosses, knots, and figures arranged with deliberate precision. They suggest a shared language understood by initiates, invisible to outsiders. Stone becomes archive. If former Templars settled here, architecture offered permanence. Symbols could survive when documents could not. Carved meaning cannot be seized or burned. These sites do not prove survival, but they imply continuity. Someone remembered enough to encode it. Someone believed the future would eventually look back. And in that belief, the past refused to stay buried. Such symbolism invites uncomfortable questions about who commissioned it and why authorities allowed it. Either ignorance protected it or influence did. Both possibilities suggest survival not as myth, but as quiet integration within accepted society. The stones do not shout secrets. They whisper patience, waiting for eyes willing to see beyond decoration and into intention, timing, and concealed allegiance carved deliberately against medieval orthodoxy and the narratives imposed later by victorious authorities. Scotland answers some questions, but never all of them. It explains how the Templars might have survived and why traces linger without documentation. Yet something remains unresolved. Survival alone does not explain scale, reach, or later influence. If Scotland sheltered fugitives, it did so quietly. There is no evidence of vast fleets settling permanently, no explosion of wealth demanding explanation. The theory feels partial, as though it describes a chapter, not the entire book. This incompleteness is telling. It suggests movement rather than settlement. Scotland may have been refuge, not destination, a place to wait, recover, and decide. Clues appear, then fade. Symbols remain, but actions move elsewhere. History here feels paused, like a breath held between dangers. That sensation matters. It implies intention beyond survival. The Templars were planners, not merely survivors. If Scotland played a role, it was within a larger design. The fleet's story does not end on these shores. It simply becomes harder to follow, dissolving again into silence. This lingering uncertainty is precisely why the Scotland theory persists. It offers enough evidence to intrigue, but not enough to conclude. In mystery, that balance sustains obsession. Scotland feels like a waypoint, meaningful yet incomplete, pointing outward toward deeper waters and unfinished intentions. The question of the fleet demands more than refuge. It demands direction, purpose, and continuity, elements that seem to stretch beyond any single land or explanation, left deliberately unresolved by those who understood secrecy best and power of absence. Long before Columbus set sail, certain maps appeared that refused to behave like mistakes. They show coastlines where none should exist, land masses drawn with confidence rather than guesswork. Medieval cartography was often symbolic, yet these maps feel different. They suggest knowledge, not imagination. Scholars debate them endlessly, unsure whether to dismiss or explain. Some of these charts depict Western lands across the Atlantic, positioned with unsettling accuracy. The outlines are crude but intentional. They're not marked as myths or monsters. They are presented as geography. That distinction matters. It implies the mapmaker believed the information was real. Where could such knowledge come from? Official history offers no answer. Viking contact explains some northern hints, but not southern contours. Trade routes do not extend that far. Yet the maps exist, preserved in archives, quietly resisting erasure. For those tracing the Templar fleet, these maps feel less coincidental. An order with resources, secrecy, and maritime capability might possess knowledge others did not. Maps are not discovered accidentally. They are compiled from reports, measurements, and repeated confirmation. If ships crossed the Atlantic, maps would follow. Not public ones, but guarded references meant for those who needed to know. The existence of these maps does not prove a Templar crossing, but it fractures certainty. History begins to feel edited, as if pages were removed once their implications grew dangerous, leaving behind fragments that no longer fit the official story. The common image of medieval ships underestimates what necessity can produce. Templar vessels were not simple fishing boats. They were cargo carriers, troop transports, and long-range haulers built for endurance. Evidence suggests they were sturdier, deeper-hulled, and more adaptable than typical European designs of the period. Operating across the Mediterranean required reliability. Storms, pirates, and distance demanded innovation. Over time, subtle advancements emerged. Reinforced keels, improved rigging, modular cargo holds. None of this was revolutionary alone, but together it extended range and survivability. Critics argue Atlantic crossings were impossible with such technology. Yet impossibility often reflects assumption, not testing. Currents flow westward. Winds can be learned. If ships could reach the Canary Islands, pushing farther was not unthinkable, it was merely undocumented. Templar secrecy complicates the question. They did not advertise routes. Success would invite scrutiny. Failure would leave no record. Knowledge could be guarded within a small circle, preserved orally, refined quietly. If the fleet vanished intentionally, its ships were chosen for more than escape. They were chosen for distance. Design becomes intention made physical. The idea that such ships could cross the Atlantic no longer feels absurd. It feels unacknowledged, resting uncomfortably between capability and silence. On the coast of Nova Scotia lies Oak Island, a place defined not by discovery but by absence. For over 2 centuries, excavators have searched for a treasure that resists recovery. Shafts collapse. Flood tunnels activate. Efforts fail with uncanny consistency. Legends connect Oak Island to pirates, nobles, and lost empires, yet one theory persists with unusual tenacity: the Knights Templar. Symbols found nearby echo Templar imagery. Engineering features suggest planning far beyond random burial. Whoever built the system understood water control, depth, and patience. If a fleet crossed the Atlantic, Oak Island fits as destination. Remote, defensible, and difficult to approach unnoticed. Treasure could be hidden without intent of retrieval, designed instead for preservation. Skeptics dismiss these connections as romantic projection. Yet the site's sophistication remains unexplained. Medieval Europe possessed the engineering knowledge required. What it lacked was motivation. The Templars had both. Oak Island may not be proof, but it is provocation. It refuses closure, much like the fleet itself. The more it is studied, the more it resists resolution, as if secrecy was built into its very design, anticipating centuries of curiosity without surrender. At some point, patterns demand acknowledgement, maps suggesting unknown lands, ships capable of reaching them, a treasure site that defies logic. Taken alone, each can be dismissed. Together, they form an uncomfortable narrative thread. Historians caution against connecting dots too eagerly. Coincidence exists. Human imagination fills gaps, yet skepticism cuts both ways. Refusal to connect patterns can be as biased as overinterpretation. The Templars possessed motive, means, and opportunity. They had reason to disappear beyond reach and resources to attempt it. That does not make every theory true, but it keeps them plausible. What complicates matters is consistency. Similar symbols appear across continents. Engineering principles repeat. Stories echo despite separation. This suggests transmission, not invention. Whether the Atlantic crossing occurred or not, the mystery persists because it challenges the boundaries of accepted history. It asks whether exploration began earlier, quietly, and for reasons never recorded. If so, the Templar fleet was not escaping history. It was stepping outside it, leaving behind clues subtle enough to be doubted, but persistent enough to survive. The question remains unresolved, not because evidence is lacking, but because its implications are too disruptive to accept easily. For centuries, the phrase Templar treasure has conjured images of chests filled with gold and silver, hauled away under moonlight. Yet this fixation on metal may be the greatest misdirection of all. Gold can be seized, spent, and replaced. The true power of the Knights Templar lay elsewhere, in what they knew rather than what they owned. As bankers, diplomats, and warriors, the Templars handled information most men never saw. They safeguarded contracts between kings, mediated debts, and moved confidential correspondence across borders. Over time, this created archives of knowledge unmatched in medieval Europe. Documents revealing royal weaknesses, secret alliances, or financial dependencies could be worth more than any coin. There are also darker possibilities. Rumors persist of texts recovered in the Holy Land, writings deemed heretical or dangerous by church authorities. Knowledge challenging accepted theology would explain both secrecy and fear. Such material could not be destroyed easily nor revealed without consequence. If the fleet carried treasure, it may have carried memory itself. Ledgers, maps, relics, and coded records capable of reshaping power structures quietly. This reframes the mystery. The question is no longer where the gold went, but where the truth was taken, and why it has never been allowed to return. Among the most controversial claims surrounding the Templars are those involving sacred relics. Stories place them in possession of artifacts linked to biblical history, objects whose existence alone would destabilize religious authority. The Ark of the Covenant, fragments of the True Cross, even forbidden texts attributed to early Christianity all appear in speculation. Historians dismiss these claims publicly, yet rarely engage them deeply. The reason may be methodological caution, or it may be something else entirely. Relics sit at the intersection of faith, power, and legitimacy. Their verification would force uncomfortable reassessment. What is known is that the Templars had unprecedented access. They excavated beneath sacred sites. They operated in regions where early Christian communities once flourished. Their secrecy invites suspicion not because it proves possession, but because it aligns with necessity. If relics existed, they could not be displayed or sold. Their value would lie in leverage, not devotion. Hidden relics protect influence quietly. Whether these artifacts were real or symbolic, belief in them shaped behavior. Kings feared the order. The church moved decisively. Such reactions suggest more than simple greed. Something about the Templars threatened established narratives, and that threat, real or perceived, would be worth hiding forever. Searches for Templar treasure have spanned continents and centuries, yet none have succeeded conclusively. Each failure invites ridicule, but the pattern itself demands explanation. Treasure hunters follow maps, legends, and symbols, yet always arrive too late or dig too shallow. One explanation is obvious: the treasure never existed. Another is less comforting: it was never meant to be recovered. If the goal was preservation, not retrieval, then concealment would be permanent. Locations would be chosen for inaccessibility, not convenience. Traps would delay, not defend. Knowledge-based treasure compounds this difficulty. Documents can be scattered, divided, encoded. Without context, they appear meaningless. Recovery requires understanding, not excavation. There is also the possibility of guardianship. If networks survived, access could be controlled. The absence of discovery may reflect active prevention rather than failure. Every unsuccessful search reinforces the same conclusion. Either nothing was hidden or it was hidden extraordinarily well, given the order's capabilities. The latter feels disturbingly plausible. The treasure resists recovery because it was designed to resist time, curiosity, and ambition alike. The idea that treasure exists solely to be found is a modern assumption. For the Templars, secrecy was survival. Their greatest asset may have been restraint. By hiding what mattered most, they ensured it could not be weaponized against them. Hidden treasure shapes history differently. It influences indirectly through rumor, fear, and possibility. It becomes a shadow presence, altering decisions without appearing. That kind of power does not fade. It waits. If the Templars intended their treasure to remain concealed, then success is measured by absence. The fact that nothing definitive has emerged suggests effectiveness, not failure. This reframes centuries of obsession as proof of design. Every unanswered question confirms the plan worked. The treasure's value lies not in revelation, but in control of narrative. Perhaps the greatest misdirection is the search itself. While attention remains fixed on gold and relics, the real inheritance persists quietly, embedded in institutions, symbols, and knowledge that shape the world without ever announcing its source. If so, the treasure was never lost. It was simply removed from reach exactly as intended. The Vatican presents itself as history's greatest archive, a place where centuries are preserved in ink and parchment. Yet when it comes to the Knights Templar, that archive feels incomplete. Scholars who have studied the order quickly encounter gaps, restrictions, and references to files that cannot be accessed. Entire sequences of correspondence appear to end abruptly, as if the story simply stops. Official explanations point to loss, damage, or routine classification. But the consistency of these absences raises suspicion. The Templars were one of the most documented organizations of their time. Their trial involved kings, popes, and public confessions. For such an event, silence should be impossible. Instead, critical moments vanish into sealed collections. Requests are denied, permissions are limited. Even modern researchers acknowledge that what is available feels curated rather than complete. This matters because institutions preserve what they find useful. What they conceal often threatens authority. If records remain hidden, it suggests the contents still carry consequence. The missing files do not prove conspiracy. They prove discomfort. Somewhere within those shelves may lie explanations that challenge the narrative of guilt and destruction. And until they are released, absence continues to speak louder than ink. shaping suspicion as powerfully as any written confession or trial transcript buried beyond reach. In 2001, a forgotten document resurfaced, forcing historians to reconsider everything. The Chinon parchment, long misfiled, revealed that in 1308 the highest leaders of the Templars were secretly absolved by Pope Clement VII. The Church, at its core, had not found them guilty of heresy. This revelation stunned scholars. Publicly, the order was condemned. Privately, forgiveness had already occurred. The contradiction reframes the entire suppression as political rather than theological. The Pope acted under pressure, balancing truth against survival. Yet the parchment raises more questions than it answers. If the Templars were absolved, why were they still destroyed? Why was this document buried rather than proclaimed? The answer may lie in compromise. Absolution addressed spiritual guilt, not institutional danger. The order may have been forgiven but deemed too powerful to continue. This discovery confirms one thing with certainty: the official story is incomplete. If one document could remain hidden for centuries, how many others remain unseen? The Chinon parchment proves that secrecy was not accidental, it was policy. And policies exist to manage information considered too volatile for public memory. The Chinon parchment forces a distinction history often avoids. Forgiveness and survival are not the same. The Church may have absolved the Templars spiritually while still dismantling them politically. In that separation lies the key to understanding what truly threatened authority. If heresy was not the real crime, then power was. The order controlled wealth, land, and loyalty beyond any crown. That could not be forgiven. This duality explains the strange tone of the trials. Confessions were extracted, yet charges shifted. Executions occurred, yet official guilt remained ambiguous. The Church sought to dissolve the institution without admitting error. Private absolution protected doctrine. Public condemnation protected hierarchy. The truth was divided. For the fleet, this matters deeply. If the order was not spiritually condemned, then survival elsewhere was not rebellion. It was continuation. The Church could look away while kings acted. What was forgiven was belief. What was not forgiven was independence. That distinction suggests the fleet's disappearance was not opposed by Rome as strongly as later narratives imply. Silence may have been permission, and permission changes everything. If the Vatican holds records that remain sealed, the question becomes why. What knowledge persists that cannot be contextualized safely? One possibility is logistical. Documents may record the fate of the fleet, destinations, agreements, or understandings reached behind closed doors. Releasing such information would expose complicity, not just survival. Another possibility is ideological. If the Templars possessed knowledge that challenged doctrine or authority, its existence would destabilize belief systems carefully maintained. Institutions fear precedent. Admitting that an order was destroyed unjustly or that its leaders were forgiven opens the door to questioning other actions. Silence preserves legitimacy. The fleet's destination may not be lost. It may be archived, referenced obliquely, and deliberately ignored. Until those files are opened, speculation fills the void. And speculation, once entrenched, becomes its own force. The Vatican's silence does not erase the mystery, it sustains it. By withholding answers, it ensures the question of the Templar fleet remains alive, unresolved, and dangerous enough to endure across centuries as a reminder that some truths are buried, not because they are false, but because they are too powerful to be released. When an institution disappears abruptly, its ideas rarely vanish with it. They migrate. After 1307, the Knights Templar fade from official record, yet their principles seem to reappear in unexpected places. Later brotherhoods emphasize secrecy, mutual recognition, layered initiation, and loyalty above all else. These are not unique concepts, but their combination feels familiar. Across Europe, small orders and private societies begin to value hidden knowledge and internal discipline. They operate quietly, often avoiding direct political confrontation while influencing finance, trade, and ideology indirectly. Historians debate lineage, but patterns persist. The emphasis shifts from visible power to continuity. This is not proof of direct survival, it is something subtler. Institutional memory can outlive institutions. Men trained in one system do not forget its logic when names change. If former Templars lived on, they would have learned from failure. Visibility had made them vulnerable. Survival required obscurity. Influence would need to flow through culture rather than command. Seen this way, the end of the order marks an evolution, not extinction. The Templars cease to exist as an army and continue as an idea, one that values preparation, secrecy, and long horizons. Such ideas do not announce themselves. They embed, waiting for moments when they can quietly shape events without ever claiming credit or revealing origin. Symbols are stubborn things. Long after the Templars were condemned, their imagery continued to surface, sometimes subtly, sometimes boldly. Crosses resembling theirs appear in architecture, manuscripts, and heraldry, often divorced from explicit explanation. This persistence unsettles historians because symbols carry memory. They are not decorative accidents. They signal belonging, continuity, and recognition. When symbols survive repression, it suggests those who understand them also survived. Over centuries, these marks appear in places associated with trade, navigation, and learned societies. The Red Cross evolves, fragments, reappears altered but recognizable. Its meaning shifts outwardly while remaining stable inwardly. Critics argue coincidence or aesthetic preference. Yet repetition across time and geography challenges that dismissal. Symbols are taught, they are chosen. If survival required silence, symbols offered a solution. They could communicate without words, identify allies without exposure. To the uninitiated, they meant nothing. To those who knew, they meant everything. The refusal of these symbols to die suggests unfinished business. A legacy carried not through declarations, but through signs meant to be overlooked. Their persistence mirrors the fleet's disappearance, not erased, but hidden in plain sight, enduring by remaining unremarkable to those who do not know what to look for. History often equates power with control of land, armies, and titles. The Templars learned otherwise. Their destruction proved that visibility invites opposition. The greatest power they discovered, too, late, is the kind that cannot be targeted. Disappearing removed them from the battlefield entirely. No enemy can strike what cannot be located. No accusation can be leveled against what has no public form. If the order survived in any sense, it did so by abandoning the structures that defined it. No uniforms, no centralized headquarters, no declarations. Influence would operate through individuals rather than institutions. This form of power leaves no monuments. It leaves outcomes, sudden shifts, unexplained continuity, the sense that events align without obvious coordination. From this perspective, disappearance becomes victory. The Templars outlived their enemies by refusing to remain visible. Such power does not demand belief. It demands patience. It works slowly, adapting, shedding identities as needed. The order that once guarded pilgrims learned to guard itself instead, and in doing so, it may have achieved the only form of survival that history cannot conclusively deny or confirm. If the fleet escaped destruction, its significance extends beyond transport. Ships connect ports, ports connect people. Over time, these connections form networks, invisible, flexible, and resilient. A fleet dispersing across seas could seed communities, knowledge, and capital wherever it landed. Each stop becomes a node, each crew a carrier of memory. This is how influence spreads without central command. The ships themselves would age and vanish, but what they delivered could persist. Skills, maps, symbols, financial practices. The infrastructure of survival does not require permanence, only transmission. This reframes the mystery. The fleet was not an end, but a beginning. Its disappearance marks the transition from overt power to distributed presence. Historians search for destinations, yet the true legacy may be relational rather than geographic. A web rather than a place. If so, the fleet achieved something rare. It transformed an endangered order into a pattern that could not be destroyed. The ships vanished, but the network endured, quietly, patiently, waiting beyond the reach of records, names, and definitive conclusions, exactly where history struggles most to follow. Every theory about the Templar fleet fails in the same way. It tries to end the story too neatly. One destination, one outcome, one conclusion. Yet the evidence resists compression. Traces appear in Portugal, Scotland, across the Atlantic, and within institutions that should not logically connect. This fragmentation is not a weakness of the mystery. It may be its defining feature. Large organizations do not survive collapse by betting on a single escape route. They diversify. They divide assets, people, and knowledge, sending them in multiple directions to reduce risk. If the fleet vanished, it may have done so in pieces, not as one dramatic departure. This would explain why no single answer satisfies. Each theory captures part of the truth while missing the whole. One route explains survival, another explains influence, another explains secrecy. Together they form a mosaic rather than a map. Historians struggle with distributed outcomes. Archives prefer linearity, but reality often behaves differently, especially under pressure. If the Templars planned for erasure, fragmentation would be strategy, not accident. Pieces could survive independently, re-emerging when conditions allowed. The absence of a single answer does not mean the fleet was lost. It means it succeeded. It dissolved itself into history so thoroughly that reconstruction becomes guesswork. The truth exists, but not in one place. It exists everywhere quietly, incomplete by design, waiting for recognition rather than discovery. There is one possibility most historians avoid, not because it lacks evidence, but because it refuses closure. What if the fleet's mission never ended? What if disappearance was not escape, but transition? If the Templars shifted from visible order to hidden network, then survival was not the goal. Continuity was. The fleet may have carried the tools needed to outlast centuries, knowledge, capital, and methods of secrecy. Those tools do not expire. This idea unsettles because it implies presence without proof, influence without authorship, a legacy that does not announce itself. Institutions today display patterns the Templars pioneered: decentralized finance, coded communication, symbolic membership. These parallels do not prove lineage, but they provoke discomfort. If the mission continued, it would adapt endlessly, shedding names and forms. That makes it untraceable by conventional history. The possibility is avoided because it turns the mystery inward. It asks not where the fleet went, but whether its logic still operates. Perhaps the greatest success of the fleet was teaching history to stop looking for it, to assume the story ended. If so, The mission succeeded beyond expectation, becoming invisible precisely because it never needed to reappear. The destruction of the Knights Templar is often framed as justice served or power corrected. That framing belongs to those who prevailed. History, after all, is curated by survivors, not by the silenced. Official records emphasize trials, confessions, and executions. They minimize gaps, inconsistencies, and unanswered questions. This creates the illusion of resolution. Yet illusions require maintenance. What history omits often matters more than what it records. The absence of fleet records, the silence of ports, the missing Vatican files all point to selective memory. Not everything was forgotten. Some things were excluded. Victors shape narratives to legitimize outcomes. Admitting that the order escaped with assets, knowledge, or absolution would undermine authority. Silence becomes policy. This does not require conspiracy. It requires alignment of interest. Kings, popes, and chroniclers all benefited from a simplified story. The result is a version of history that feels complete until examined closely. Then fractures appear. Understanding this reframes the mystery. The fleet may not be missing from history. It may have been edited out, and edited stories leave traces, contradictions, and questions that refuse to disappear, no matter how often certainty is repeated. The most unsettling conclusion is also the simplest. The Templar fleet may not be lost at all. It may be hidden, dispersed, and embedded so deeply that searching for it as an object misses the point entirely. If the fleet transformed into a network, then its movement would be subtle. Not ships crossing seas, but ideas crossing generations. Not banners raised, but symbols preserved. Such a legacy would feel like coincidence until examined collectively. Patterns would emerge only in hindsight. The mystery persists because it never resolved into ruin. It evolved. That makes it harder to confront and easier to dismiss. Yet dismissal does not erase impact. Something ended in 1307, but something else began. Perhaps the fleet's final destination was not land at all, but time, a future where its existence could be doubted, argued, and endlessly reinterpreted. That is the chilling possibility. The Templars did not vanish. They learned how to survive history itself. And if that is true, then the fleet is not waiting to be found. It is waiting to be noticed, moving quietly beneath the surface of what we think we know, enduring precisely because it never demands belief, only patience, silence, and the willingness to disappear when survival requires it most.